What is the most successful lie in history? When the Allies tricked Germany into thinking D Day was happening at other locations, which weakened their defenses at the primary landing points. The person who relayed the message to the Germans was Agent Garbo, aka Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spaniard who wanted to spy for the Allies when the war broke out because he hated fascism. He was rejected by both the British and American intelligence agencies because they thought he was too eager and thus a likely spy. So he approached the Germans and told them that he had a spy syndicate already set up in England, using information from encyclopedias, newsreels, and pre-war tourism brochures to sell the ruse, despite having never set foot in the country at all. Because all of Germany's own spies were so utterly crap, both because their spy master was already turned, and because they just didn't know enough about England to pass as effective agents, Garbo ended up being their most effective agent. And when the British learned that the elusive agent they were hunting was basically just pranking the Germans, they were able to get him on their side rather easily to feed information to the Germans. He was the one who corroborated Operation Mincemeat by verifying the identity of the dead general found floating off the coast of Spain. Then, when the invasion had already started, he made a mad dash attempt to get in contact with his German handlers and told them that the Allies had made a last-minute change to their invasion plans and were now attacking Normandy instead of Calais, when the information was basically useless. Then had the gall to call them incompetent for not getting the message to the relative authorities fast enough. He was actually decorated with the highest honors by both sides of the war for his bravery as a spy, believe it or not. One, a major flaw in Germany's training of parachute spies was that they were too rigid and precise in their operations, while also being a bit ignorant about the culture within the countries they were infiltrating, or the information they were operating on was woefully out of date. For example, they were often exposed due to being unable to understand Britain's pre-decimated currency, which often had several types of coin for differing values, 240 pence to a pound or one including halfpennies. The British TV series Foyle's War makes use of real-life anecdote where a spy was immediately apprehended when he walked into a pub at 8 in the morning and tried to order a pint of ale. He was immediately exposed because a British citizen would know that it was illegal to sell alcohol in a pub before 11 a.m. The Russians also had their own special tale based around forged documents. They could tell when a German spy was presenting fake identity papers based on the staples used. Germans would use stainless steel. Russians, who believed wasting resources on something just used to hold paper together, would use iron staples which would rust over time. Second, the purpose of Operation Mincemeat was pretty simple. Britain knew that despite officially being neutral in the conflict, the fascist Spain was helping the Axis powers on the side and allowing them to operate as spies on British diplomats within the country, both to feed false information to the enemies and to punish Spain for their treachery. They took a vagrant who had passed away from pneumonia, dressed him up as a British general, and dumped him off the coast of Spain with some fake documents regarding the invasion in a diplomatic pouch. Sure enough, the Spanish government allowed the Germans to open and photograph those documents. Garbo's part of the plan was to act as a second, separate source of information regarding the invasion. He was to have one of his fake agents get ended in the line of duty in a high-risk operation to get their hands on the information about the forthcoming Calais invasion, which he then passed on to his superiors in Germany. With two pieces of information verifying each other, the Germans bolstered their defenses at Calais while leaving Normandy relatively defenseless. Just to add a bit more detail, in most cases when information was sent by mail, they would be artificially delayed by the British, so they would stamp the correct date of when it should have gone out but delay it so the villains would think that if they had read it sooner, they would have got up-to-date information. Eventually, he would receive radio equipment. So he approached the Germans and told them that they had a spy syndicate already set up in England, using information from encyclopedias, newsreels, and pre-war tourism brochures to sell the ruse, despite having never set foot in the country at all. When he told the Germans about his imaginary syndicate, as Garcia could not stay in England, he set himself up in Portugal and kept receiving expenses from Germany. Each expense was meant to go to the imaginary spies, but as another commenter mentioned, he didn't know how many pounds, pence, and shillings worked, so it was difficult to get realistic expense reports. Garbo also received a code book from them which helped the men and women over in Bletchley Park. When the war was over, Garcia escaped to South America thinking there might be repercussions for his activities. When the British wanted to reward him for his efforts, they didn't know where he went, but knew he originally came from Spain, so they literally went calling every J. Garcia in the Barcelona phone book to find him, and apparently got to a relative of his who told them where he was hiding. Garcia did come back to England to get his reward. Now, if I remember correctly, the Germans also awarded him a medal, making him the only person to receive medals from both sides of the conflict. The Germans never knew he was a spy even after the war. Story 2. That money doesn't buy happiness, just a lie spun around by rich people, so middle, lower class people never go after it and buy into the delusion of money not being the answer to their problems when, in fact, it very much is. Same goes for countless other BS we've been taught for God knows how long. To everyone saying that it doesn't, tell that to people who are poor, barely have anything to their name, and are struggling to survive. I stand by my statement. It may not buy happiness to you and others, but as someone who has grown up in absolutely nothing, money is the reason I was deprived of happiness. So the statement holds true for me, and I'm sure most third world country citizens would agree with me as I belong to one as well. Not all truths are universal, I suppose. Story 3. The North may have won the Civil War, but the South won the war for its collective memory for a very long time. Historians agree and have for a while that it was empirically about slavery, but contextualization after the war was very effective at changing that narrative to be about states' rights, rugged individualism, and loyalty. Discriminatory tropes and characters shifted portrayal of black people from active participants in the fight to freedom with their own agency to passive, docile, and ignorant bystanders. This was continuously reinforced by our media for decades, and in the effort to get our nation to heal from such a tumultuous fracturing was actively embraced by many of the powers that be for the sake of unity. The centennial celebrations of the American Revolution notably included quite a few of them former Confederates. Military bases and many fixtures of public life featured the names of Confederate soldiers and officers. Vice President Spiro Agnew honored the loyalty of the rebels at the Stone Mountain Confederate Monument dedication in 1970. Of course, you've probably heard even today the resistance to removing these monuments, and even relook at how we have interacted with this part of our history. It wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s that the public started to examine this imagined past in closer detail. Even then, after 9/11, the rally around the flag movement froze a lot of the more critical examinations at our nation's history for years. I grew up in New England exclusively hearing the states' rights arguments in grade school, which even at that point was a known lie amongst the professional historical community, but still being taught to kids. If you want more information, a good book, if a bit wordy, is Race and Reunion by David W. Blight. For those of you who don't want to read a 450-page nonfiction book, John Oliver has a good segment on it as well from his show Last Week Tonight. Story 4. That black people and watermelon are discriminatory stereotypes. The truth is that when the slaves were freed, they grew and sold watermelon as a way to earn money to feed, clothe, and house themselves. The watermelon was actually a symbol of freedom and self-reliance for newly freed slaves. What happened was that the former slave owners saw this and started a propaganda campaign to turn white people away from buying N food, as they called it. It's probably one of the earliest examples of the press manipulating the truth for its owners. This is where the big lips and eating like animals pictures came from. When black people started selling chickens, the same thing happened. Only this time it came in movie form. The black people and fried chicken thing started in The Birth of a Nation, the horrible movie, which should be symbols of freedom and self-reliance to a people struggling after centuries of slavery were twisted into symbols of shame. So much so that 100 years later, they are both still seen with negative connections. Yeah, and such a weird stereotype too, like those are two staple foods of American cuisine and nearly universally loved as well. Story 5. You need to buy a stone on a ring to show some form of dedication. It was specifically when breach of promise lawsuits were abolished. Before the early 20th century, engagements were legally binding, at least in the US and Britain, to the extent that a jilted fiancé could sue for monetary damages to compensate for her presumed loss of V-card and consequent reputation damage. When the laws were changed to abolish these lawsuits, expensive engagement rings came into fashion, which would function as a deposit. That's also the reason for the convention that the ring would only be returned if the woman were the one who broke the engagement. While she'd keep the ring if the man broke it off, the at fault party is the one who forfeits the deposit. In the US, the custom of expensive engagement rings got a further boost in the 1970s, when a period of high inflation meant that cash savings and conventionally safe fixed income investments lost a lot of their real value while jewelry and collectibles kept up with the general increase in prices, and then some as people noticed that those seemed to be a good investment and bought into the market. So a generation of Americans got it into their heads that jewelry would hold or gain value, and thus were investments rather than consumption items. Story 6. The harder you work, the more you'll get paid. The highest paying position in a company requires no work at all. No matter how hard you work, you can never get there. Most CEOs are in meetings upon meetings all day, every day, and have very little spare time, if at all. They're also seen as the face of the company, so if the company is in a PR crisis or financially underwater, the CEO takes the hit and is probably grinding like hell to keep the money afloat. Not to mention the travel that's involved as well as all the risk they had to take on to build the company from the ground up. I've worked a lot of different jobs from $5.75 an hour to $200,000, and I can confidently tell you that the less a job pays, the harder it is, the more stressful it is, the less slack you're given, and the more you're treated like crap. Minimum wage job, get screamed at for being 2 minutes late, work yourself to the bone for 12 hours straight, while people treat you like human garbage and your boss rides your bum for not putting in enough hustle. High-paying job, show up 2 hours late, look around on the internet, answer some Slack messages, get free lunch, do a little easy work, sit in a meeting or two, pet the office cat, and stroll out the door when you feel like it. Exaggerating a bit, but it's pretty much like that. Well, it's because at the end of the day, what a job pays is based on supply and demand. If you're being paid well, I guess, it's because not many people can do the job. So you have a lot more leverage and they have to treat you better as a result. Companies that pay well know this and want to keep their employees happy. It has nothing to do with hard work. The only thing you get from hard work is more work. Consistent work? Yeah, that's the key. Anyway, since you're already here, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Story 7. Cigarette companies. Look at the ads all throughout the years from Doctors Agree, Cigarettes Are Good For You, to Joe Camel, Marlboro Man, etc. Even when they were finally forced to put warnings on their cartons about how cigarettes can literally end you, it's still a billion-dollar industry. I know there's more heinous lies out there, but this one hits home for me. Interesting story. Frederick III, heir to the throne of German emperor in the 19th century, suffered from throat cancer. His doctors told him to smoke, as that would help. He diligently followed their advice, which didn't really help and alleviate his suffering. Read the book Thank You for Smoking by Christopher Buckley, written before the tobacco companies admitted they knew. Great book. Movie doesn't do it justice, of course. Story 8. Some tech for background. Have you ever heard of a radar detector? How about a radar detector, which the police use to see if you have a detector? Ever wonder how they work? I mean, a radar detector is a receiver. How could the police possibly know you have one? Until recently, practically every radio used a concept called superheterodyne. Basically, there's a tiny radio transmitter in your receiver. That signal is mixed with the one from the antenna, and the result is what your receiver tunes to. It's one of the most important inventions of the 20th century, and you most likely never heard of it. Poor Ed, all he got for his work was jumping out of a window to his demise. The problem is that sometimes the tiny transmitter is poorly shielded and some of it leaks back out the antenna. If you know what that intermediate frequency is, you can listen to it. The escort radar detectors, which were super popular in the 80s, leak like a sieve. Presto, radar detectors. Takeaway, if you know what you're looking for, you can actually detect someone else's radio receiver. The setup. In 1942, RAF planes began using VHF radar to look for German submarines leaving port in France at night. All of a sudden, they were getting sunk en masse. The Germans were familiar with other British radars working around this frequency and were able to find the new radar's frequency around August. So they built a receiver, Meatox, which was tuned to this frequency. When a plane using this radar was anywhere in the area, Meatox would play a sound into the radio operator's headphones. By October, most of the fleet had it, and the RAF pilots were returning with stories about how the U-boats would always dive as soon as they turned toward them to attack. But the RAF had prepared for this moment. They knew it was only a matter of time before the Germans found the frequency. Earlier, two grad students had come up with a new device called the magnetron that produced very strong radio signals from a device the size of a bread box. And the signal was really short, about 10 centimeters, whereas their older radars were 150. So Metox was completely incapable of hearing it. It was tuned way too far from the frequency of the new signal. They rushed the new system into production, and the first sets started arriving just in time for the U-boat campaign to start up again in spring when the weather got better. By March, it was clear to the Germans something was up. Their boats were getting sunk en masse again, and the ones that escaped attack said there was no warning on their detectors. They tried everything to detect the new signal, but they just couldn't find it. And now the lie. Knowing something was up, U-boats were on high alert all the time. One got lucky and shot down its attacker and captured the crew. During interrogation, they asked why they could no longer detect the radar. The pilot told them they no longer used radar. Instead, he claimed they had a receiver for Metox, and under perfect conditions, they could pick it up 90 miles away. They only turned on the radio at the last minute for range measurements so they knew when to drop the depth charges. By that time, the U-boat was too busy exploding to notice. The Germans didn't believe him, but it was technically possible once you can indeed make a receiver to detect your receiver. And Metox was known to be leaky as it was deliberately built quick and cheap from a pre-war French radio set. So they built their own Metox receiver in the lab, and sure enough, they could detect it. So then they put it on a plane and detected one of their boats 60 miles away. Utter panic. Orders were sent out to all boats, turn off Metox. And so not only did the RAF get to keep using their fancy new magnetron radar without the Germans even trying to detect it, but then they turned off their perfectly good Metox detectors, and all the RAF planes with the older radars suddenly started working again too. And that is the greatest lie ever, because by the end of June the U-boat fleet was on the bottom of the ocean. This was not due entirely to this trick. There was a number of things that all arrived at almost the same time that did it. It was a combination of the new radars, Huffduff, larger numbers of frigates dedicated to the task, and the lack of any detectors on the U-boats that made even the old radars work again all arrived within 2 months, and that was that. The Germans finally figured it out sometime around November. Apparently, the pilot made the whole thing up on his own. This little white lie helped open the Atlantic to the convoys of 1943 that led to the end of Italy's involvement and ultimately D-Day. Alright, so this one is insane. We need a movie or at least a documentary about this, right? Story 9. That getting yourself in crazy debt at 18 years old to go to college is the only path to success in life. But I think most people know that it's not the only path to success, but statistically, it's the more reliable path to success. So, between an 80% chance of success if you go to college and 30% chance of success if you don't, the choice is clear. An interesting example is Mark Zuckerberg. College didn't teach him any newer skill to be able to start Facebook, but the trove of ideas and help from the community of people he was with made Facebook possible. Proximity to success inspires success. This lie was explicitly developed to pad the derivatives market. Take something that was available to Americans, make it indispensable to any future paying job, i.e. even secretaries or bank tellers. Jack the price up from $2,000 to $50,000, create a cycle of debt compounded with high interest, and voila. You've just underwritten empty fiat currency that was delinked from the gold standard. Bonus is that it ensures people enter the workforce ASAP, as this is the only source of actual value produced by the US, especially as the Fed can just print money willy-nilly and be able to make bets and buy and sell these debts as securities, SLABs. Frickin' criminal, man. It's why every counselor under the sun in the 2000s was encouraging kids to just take on the debt, as education is priceless. Story 10. That diamonds are valuable made one family really, really rich though. Up until the middle of the 20th century, diamonds were quite rare. Large, high-quality diamonds, even rarer. Like most gemstones and precious metals, their value relative to the competition comes from rarity and difficulty to find or extract. Now, that massive explosion in production is not completely dissimilar to other types of industrial production and the Industrial Revolution. But if your grandmother or great-grandmother got a diamond wedding ring pre-1940, that was a pretty big deal. Notice that for almost 50 years, virtually all diamonds in the world came from Southwest Africa and Namibia. Namibia, when it was colonized in the 1880s by Germany, had about 250,000 people, compared to Germany at about 70 million and half the size. Yes, now, just like steel, you can easily make large quantities of it in whatever quantity you want. But it wasn't a lie that diamonds were rare. Whether you count them as rare today, when we have 20 or 30 times as many diamonds but 5 times as many people, is another matter. Until the 1940s, good diamonds were only limited to the ultra rich. Now they are just limited to the global rich, which includes most of the Western middle class. And even then, cutting and setting gems remains relatively high skilled craftsmanship work, even if the material itself isn't that hard to grow in a lab. They're valuable in the same way gold is valuable. It's shiny and people want it. So we created artificial value. Gold was functionally worthless until advanced metallurgy and digital electronics gave it a use case. Diamonds were functionally worthless until we realized they could be attached to tools and their hardened structure gave them a use case. Gold and diamonds have intrinsic economic value, their industrial application, and their elastic personal value, like the tulip economy that ruined the Dutch. Backing a currency on gold is no different than backing it on steel. People just have some attachment to gold because it has always had value, as if that freaking counts for literally anything beyond the fact that Bronze Age humans like shiny crap that doesn't have a conceivable purpose. True, and technically they also decay into graphite, it just takes a super long time. And if you like these stories, here's more, because YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for watching this one with me.